The wind was a blade against the world. It came down from the Bighorn Mountains with a promise of death, scouring the foothills of Wyoming and stripping the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods. In the dimming light of a winter afternoon in 1886, it found the small cabin tucked against a barren rise and clawed at the chinking between the logs. Inside, the wind's howl was a constant moan, a companion to the deeper silence that had settled in Clara Hensley's bones 2 years ago and never left. She was on her knees before the stone hearth, her breath a pale ghost in the frigid air. The last of the kindling, slivers of wood she had split with an axe too heavy for her, refused to catch. Her hands were a map of her struggle. The palms were raw, blistered red where the axe handle had rubbed them raw, and the fingers, thin as twigs, were stiff with cold. She blew gently on the faint orange glow clinging to a piece of birch bark, her lungs aching with the effort. The hunger inside her was a cold, hard knot that made every movement a deliberate act of will. For a moment, the glow brightened, a fragile star in the gloom, and then, with a soft hiss, it died. A tear of frustration froze on her cheek. Her food was nearly gone. A half-full sack of flour, a handful of dried beans, and a small jar of salted pork were all that stood between her and the gnawing emptiness. Survival had become a grim arithmetic of calories and effort. Chopping wood burned what little energy the thin soup provided. Mending a dress for the baker's wife in town might earn her a stale loaf of bread. But the walk into town and back, 3 miles each way through the deepening snow, cost her more than the bread was worth. Still, she did it. She had to. The town of Redemption was not a place of forgiveness for her. To them, she was not Clara Hensley, a woman of 27 who had once known laughter. She was the cursed widow. The whispers followed her like a shadow whenever she dared to show her face. They said she had watched the barn burn with her husband inside it. They said she had not shed a single tear at his burial. They said a woman who could lose her husband in such a way and go on living alone in the wilderness must have a shard of ice where her heart should be. Some of the more pious women made the sign against evil when she passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They did not know the truth, but they had crafted a story that suited them, a story of a cold woman and a righteous fire. The truth was something Clara kept locked away, buried deeper than the frozen earth outside. She did not need their whispers to remind her of that night. The memory lived in her, a constant, low fever. Her husband, Thomas, had not been a good man. He was a man of heavy hands and a thirst that was never quenched. He had a temper that simmered like a pot left too long on the stove, and it often boiled over onto her. He called her barren because she had not given him a son. He called her useless because she could not make their small, failing ranch turn a profit. His words were stones, and for 5 years, he had thrown them at her until she had built a wall around her soul just to keep from shattering. She remembered the smell of whiskey on his breath, a sour, cloying scent that always preceded the cruelty. He would back her into a corner of this very cabin, his shadow swallowing the lamplight, his voice a low growl as he listed her failings. The fear was a living thing then, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. He never broke her bones, but he had a talent for breaking her spirit, for finding the softest parts of her and pressing down until she went numb. The night of the fire, he had been worse than usual. A deal for a dozen heads of cattle had fallen through, and he had come home from Redemption smelling of cheap liquor and rage. He had stormed out to the barn, shouting that he would sleep with the animals rather than share a bed with a worthless wife. Clara had remained in the cabin, her body trembling, listening to him stumbling around in the dark, cursing her name, cursing his luck, cursing God. She had seen the flicker of orange light through the cabin's single, grimy window. At first, it was just a small, dancing flame, like a captured firefly. Then it grew, angry and bright, licking its way up the dry timber of the barn walls. She had run to the door, her hand on the latch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her teeth. She should have screamed. She should have run for a bucket, for help, for anything. But she stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching the flames consume the building that housed her tormentor. She heard his single, drunken shout, quickly swallowed by the roar of the fire. And in that moment, she had felt nothing but a profound, terrifying stillness. The frantic bird in her chest stopped beating its wings. The world went quiet, save for the crackle and pop of burning wood. She did not move until the roof of the barn collapsed in a shower of sparks that painted the night sky red. Freedom had a scent. She discovered that night. It smelled like smoke and ash. The town called it a mysterious accident. Clara knew it was just a drunk man and a kicked-over lantern, but her inaction, her silent witness, had damned her in their eyes and, in the darkest hours of the night, in her own as well. Guilt was a poor substitute for warmth, but it was all she had. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, rattling the door in its frame and sending a shower of soot down the chimney. The last of the daylight was gone, surrendering to a deep, starless twilight. Snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that clung to the window pane and blurred the line between earth and sky. Outside, from the direction of the woods that bordered her property, a wolf howled. It was a long, lonely cry that spoke of hunger and the wild. Another answered, closer this time. Clara shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The sound made the cabin feel smaller, more fragile, the last bastion of warmth in a world of teeth and cold. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her strength, she turned to the woodpile beside the hearth. One log remained. It was gnarled and heavy, a piece of seasoned oak that would burn slow and hot if she could ever get the fire started. She dragged it with both hands, her muscles screaming in protest, and settled it over the failed kindling. This was it, her last piece of firewood, her last defense against the encroaching night. If she could not light it, the cold would creep in, silent and patient, and by morning, it would claim her. She knelt again, her body curled into a tight ball against the chill. She closed her eyes, whispering to the empty room, to the ghosts of her past, to whatever might be listening. Just one more night, she breathed, the words barely audible over the wail of the wind. Just let me see the morning. It was then that the knock came. It was not the wind. This was a solid, deliberate sound. 3 hard raps against the wooden door that vibrated through the floorboards and straight up her spine. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. No one ever came to her cabin. No one. The townsfolk kept their distance, and the few trappers who passed through this territory knew to avoid the home of the cursed widow. Her first thought was of Thomas, a wild, irrational fear that he had somehow clawed his way out of his grave and come back for her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was the sound of a living hand, a desperate hand. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her legs unsteady. She crept toward the door, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker she kept by the hearth. It was a meager weapon, but it was something. She peered through a small crack in the shuttered window. A figure stood on her porch, a tall, broad shape silhouetted against the swirling snow. It was a man, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. "Hello?" a voice called out, rough and strained. "Anyone in there? My horse went lame. I'm just looking for shelter from the storm." The voice was deep, laced with a weariness that felt genuine. But it was the voice of a man, a stranger. Every instinct, honed by years of her husband's cruelty, screamed at her to stay silent, to pretend the cabin was empty, to let the storm take him. Let him freeze. She owed nothing to the world of men. They had given her nothing but pain and sorrow. She watched as he swayed on his feet, a shudder running through his large frame. He looked half frozen, a man at the very edge of his endurance. He lifted a hand to knock again, but it fell back to his side, as if the effort was too much. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his head bowed. She could see his breath puffing out in ragged white clouds. A war raged inside her. The fear was a cold, familiar thing, but something else was stirring within her, something she had not felt in years, a flicker of compassion. She saw not a man, but a fellow creature struggling against the same merciless winter that was trying to claim her. To leave him outside would be a death sentence. Was she capable of that? Could she, who had watched one man burn, now let another man freeze? The thought made her stomach clench. Her hand, still gripping the poker, began to tremble. Her fear was real, but his death would be real too. With a final, shuddering breath, she made her choice. Compassion, fragile and unfamiliar, won out over the terror that had been her only companion for so long. She slid the heavy bolt back. The sound was deafening in the silence. The door creaked open, pulled inward by the wind, and the storm rushed into the cabin, bringing with it a swirl of snow and the biting cold. The man stumbled forward, catching himself on the doorframe. He was tall, taller than Thomas had been, and his frame was lean beneath a ragged sheepskin coat covered in a layer of ice. He slowly lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. They were dark and shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around them. His face was weathered, his jaw covered in a dark stubble, and a thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice raw. He took another step inside, out of the wind's direct assault, and the door swung shut behind him, plunging the room back into near darkness, save for the faint gray light from the window. Clara took a step back, raising the poker slightly. "Just until the storm passes," she said, her voice thin and rusty from disuse. The man nodded, pulling off his frozen gloves. "I would be grateful." He moved toward the hearth with the slow, deliberate steps of a man whose body was screaming in protest. The air between them was thick with tension. It felt charged, electric, a strange and unsettling current in the stagnant silence of her life. For 2 years, she had been utterly alone. The presence of another human being, especially a man, was a shock to her system, a violation of the tomb she had built around herself. He knelt by the fire, his back to her, and stretched his hands toward the cold stones as if they could offer some memory of warmth. She watched his every move, her knuckles white on the poker. He was ragged, but he carried himself with a certain stillness, a coiled readiness that spoke of a life lived on the edge. A worn gun belt was buckled around his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh. The handle of the pistol was dark and smooth with use. He turned his head slightly, sensing her gaze. "My name is Elias Ward." "Clara," she managed to say, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement and then turned his attention back to the hearth. He seemed to understand her fear, her need for distance. He did not press her for more. Instead, he reached for the small pile of kindling she had abandoned. His hands, she noticed, were scarred. The knuckles were calloused and bruised, and a long, jagged scar ran across the back of his left hand. The skin puckered and white. These were not the hands of a farmer. They were the hands of a man who knew violence. Like her, he was a survivor. Like her, he was running from something. The thought did not comfort her. It only deepened her unease. He worked with a quiet efficiency, rearranging the kindling, using his knife to shave off thin, dry curls from the side of the log. He found the flint and steel on the mantel and, with a few practiced strikes, brought a spark to life. This time, the tinder caught. A small, determined flame flickered, and he nurtured it with a patience that surprised her, gently adding larger splinters until a proper fire was crackling in the hearth. The flames pushed back the oppressive cold and filled the small cabin with a warm, dancing light. It cast long shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both more intimate and more menacing. Elias Ward sat back on his heels, watching the fire as if it were the most important thing in the world. He unbuttoned his coat, steam beginning to rise from the damp wool. Clara slowly lowered the poker, her fear receding slightly in the face of the growing warmth. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the storm outside. It was a shared silence, no longer just her own. It felt different, heavier. She retreated to the far side of the room, sitting on the edge of her simple cot, wrapping her shawl around herself as if it were armor. He did not speak for a long time. He simply stared into the flames, his profile stark and grim in the firelight. She wondered what he saw in them. What ghosts? What regrets? The fire illuminated the weariness in his face, a deep, soul-level exhaustion that she recognized all too well. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, not turning to look at her. "You look hungrier than I am." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He saw it. He saw through her pretense, through the walls she had built. He saw the truth of her, the gnawing emptiness she tried so hard to hide from the world, from herself. It was not an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a shared and terrible human condition. That night, two lonely souls sat on opposite sides of the fire in a small cabin battered by a Wyoming blizzard. The cursed widow and the scarred stranger. The silence returned, but now it was filled with the weight of his words, with the unspoken truth of all they had lost, and all they had left to fear. Neither dared to break it again. Clara awoke to a world of absolute white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and breathless silence. The wind was gone, and the only sound was the slow drip of melting snow from the eaves. She lay still on her cot, listening, her body stiff from the cold that had seeped through the thin blankets overnight. Across the small room, Elias Ward was a still shape on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in his bedroll. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, pulsing softly in the gloom. She rose quietly, her bare feet shrinking from the icy floorboards. When she peered out the window, wiping away a patch of frost with her sleeve, her breath caught in her throat. The landscape was gone, buried beneath a blanket of snow so deep and seamless it looked as if the world had been remade. The fences were gone. The woodpile was a soft mound, and the trees wore heavy white coats. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a prison. They were trapped. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, cold and sharp. Days. It would be days before the snow melted enough for anyone to travel. Days before this stranger, this man with a gun and haunted eyes, would leave her home. Her first instinct was to retreat, to make herself small and unnoticeable. She moved about the cabin with a deliberate quietness, avoiding his side of the room. She was acutely aware of him, even in sleep. His presence filled the small space, a solid, masculine energy that was both unsettling and, to her shame, faintly reassuring. It had been 2 years since she had shared her home with anyone, and her solitude had become a shell. Now, that shell was cracked. When he finally stirred, rolling over with a low groan, she pretended to be busy with a water bucket, keeping her back to him. She could feel his eyes on her. "Morning," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "The snow is deep," she replied, her voice tight. It was not the greeting he had offered, but it was all she could manage. It was a statement of fact, a wall to stand behind. He got to his feet, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. "It will be for a while." He walked to the window and looked out, his broad shoulders blocking the meager light. "We are not going anywhere soon." Clara said nothing, focusing on ladling water into the kettle. She hid her hands, which had begun to tremble again, tucking them into the folds of her skirt. The trembling was a constant betrayal. It was the hunger, the cold, the fear, all shaking their way to the surface. She tried to hold her spine straight, to project an image of a woman in control of her home, of herself. But she felt fragile as a pane of glass, certain that one wrong word, one wrong look, would shatter her composure. Elias did not seem to notice, or, if he did, he had the grace not to mention it. He simply took his coat from a peg by the door and picked up her axe. "The wood is buried. I will see about digging some out." Before she could protest, he was gone, stepping out into the blinding white. The cabin immediately felt emptier, the silence rushing back in to fill the space he had occupied. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the kettle beginning to hiss. Then, a new sound started, a steady, rhythmic thud that cut through the stillness. It was the sound of his axe biting into wood. It was a sound of purpose, of life. It was a sound Thomas had seldom made. Thomas had preferred to let the wood pile dwindle, complaining about the ache in his back until Clara, in desperation, had taken up the axe herself. The sound continued all morning, a steady heartbeat in the frozen world. Elias worked without stopping. He dug out the wood pile, split the logs with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, and stacked the fresh wood neatly on the porch. He moved with a quiet intensity, a man comfortable with hard labor. Clara watched him through the window, a strange feeling churning in her gut. He was helping her. He was a stranger, and he was doing a husband's work, a provider's work, without being asked, without demanding anything in return. When he came back inside, his face was flushed from the cold and the exertion, snowflakes melting in his dark hair. He stamped the snow from his boots and added several fresh logs to the fire, which soon blazed with a warmth the cabin had not known all winter. The oppressive chill began to retreat to the corners of the room. "That should last us," he said, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat tight. Their days fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. In the morning, Elias would chop wood or clear a path to the well. Clara would mend his coat, which had a long tear in the sleeve, her stitches small and neat. She worked with her head bowed, focusing on the needle, on the simple, familiar task that kept her from having to look at him, to speak to him, but she was always aware of him. She learned the sound of his breathing, the way he moved across the room, the quiet way he sat by the fire, cleaning his pistol with a concentration that was absolute. He took what little food they had, the flour, the salt pork, the beans, and made it last. He cooked their meals, simple stews that he let simmer for hours over the fire. The smell of it filled the cabin, a warm, savory scent that made her stomach ache with a hunger so fierce it was painful. He always gave her the larger portion, ignoring her quiet protests. "A body needs fuel to stay warm," was all he would say. Slowly, hesitantly, words began to bridge the silence between them. They were small fragments, pieces of their lives offered up like nervous gifts. One afternoon, as she was grinding the last of their coffee beans, she mentioned the difficulty of getting supplies from town. "They are not fond of you in Redemption," Elias observed, his voice neutral. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the air. Clara's hands stilled. "They have their reasons," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They think I am cursed, a woman whose husband dies in a fire on her own land. They talk." She did not look at him, ashamed of the judgment she felt sure was in his eyes. He did not reply immediately. The scraping continued for a few moments, steady and calm. "I know a thing or two about towns that talk," he said finally, his voice soft. "There was a town in the Panhandle, Abilene. I cannot go back there." He paused, his hands going still. "There was a card game, a disagreement. A boy got caught in the middle. He was not more than 16. He set the knife and stone aside, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Sometimes a place gets poisoned for you. It does not matter if you were right or wrong. The ground itself remembers the blood. Clara looked at him then. She saw the guilt in the hard set of his jaw, the regret that lived deep in his eyes. He was haunted, just as she was. His ghost was a boy with a name he would not speak. Hers was a husband whose name she despised. In that moment, she felt a flicker of connection, a shared understanding of being marked by death, of being an outcast. The next day, the last of the salt pork was gone. Elias looked into the empty stew pot and then at Clara. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. The hunger was no longer a knot in her stomach. It was a constant, dizzying weakness. "I am going to hunt," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. He stood and reached for his rifle, which had been leaning against the wall. Panic seized her. "No," she said, the word coming out sharper than she intended. "You cannot." He turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "We are out of food. Clara, there are rabbits in those woods, maybe even a deer, snowed in. The people in town, if they see you," she stammered, twisting the fabric of her apron in her hands, "they will say things. They already think I am wrong. If they see me with a man, a stranger with a gun, they will think worse. They will make your life difficult. You do not want their stain on you." She was ashamed of her reasoning, ashamed that her cursed reputation was the only thing she had to offer him, a warning to stay away. She was trying to protect him from her own shadow. Elias looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. A muscle worked in his jaw. "You think I care what a town full of gossips thinks of me?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "I have been called worse things than a widow's friend by better people than them." He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "You are starving. I am not going to sit here and watch you fade away because you are worried about whispers." He left without another word. Clara sank onto her stool by the fire, her body trembling with a mix of fear and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. No one had ever stood up for her. No one had ever chosen her well-being over the town's opinion. Thomas had thrived on their judgment, using it as another stick to beat her with. But this man, this stranger, had dismissed it as if it were nothing more than dust in the wind. He was gone for hours. As the afternoon light began to fade, a deep anxiety began to grow in Clara's chest. The woods were dangerous. There were wolves, deep snowdrifts, 100 ways for a man to get into trouble. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her, and she found herself straining to hear the sound of his footsteps, the sound of his return. The feeling was terrifyingly close to the way she used to wait for Thomas, but the fear was different. Then, she had been afraid of his arrival. Now, she was afraid he would not arrive at all. Just as the sun was setting, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the door opened. Elias stepped inside, a brace of 3 plump rabbits slung over his shoulder. He was covered in snow, his face grim with cold, but his eyes held a quiet glint of triumph. "There is meat for the pot," he said simply. Clara felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. She had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. That night, they ate a meal that felt like a holy sacrament. Elias skinned and cleaned the rabbits with an expert's precision, while Clara found a few wild onions and a sprig of dried thyme she had saved from her summer garden. He stewed the meat with the last of the beans, and soon the cabin was filled with an aroma so rich and wonderful that it brought tears to her eyes. When he ladled the thick, savory stew into her bowl, she took it with hands that shook. They sat by the fire, eating in silence. The meat was tender, the broth hot and nourishing. It was more than just food. It was life. It was warmth and strength flowing back into her, chasing away the cold that had taken up residence in her very marrow. With every spoonful, she felt a little more human, a little less like a ghost. The warmth between them grew with the fire. The small cabin, once a cold prison, now felt like a sanctuary, a small pocket of safety in a harsh world. After they finished eating, he took her empty bowl from her, and his fingers brushed against hers. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her body. It was just a simple, human touch, but it had been so long. His skin was warm and rough, and the feeling lingered on her own long after he had pulled away. They sat there for a long time, the firelight playing on their faces. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer just the discomfort of strangers. It was something else, something deeper and more complicated. Their eyes would meet across the flames, and for a long, charged moment, the world would seem to fall away. Then one of them would look away, their heart hammering. Later that night, as the fire was burning low, she finally found the words she had been searching for. She looked at him, his face softened by the dim light, and her voice was a trembling whisper when she spoke. "Thank you, Elias." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I cannot remember," she continued, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I cannot remember the last time someone fed me." The confession was a raw thing, torn from the deepest part of her. It was about more than the stew. It was about the wood he chopped, the fire he built, the quiet respect he showed her. It was about the simple, profound act of being cared for. Elias was silent for a moment. He leaned forward slightly, his voice so soft she had to strain to hear it over the crackle of the embers. "Then remember this night," he said. His words were an anchor. He was not offering her pity. He was offering her a new memory, a clean one, a memory of warmth and sustenance to place over the countless memories of cruelty and neglect. The fire had dwindled to a soft, orange glow. The cold was beginning to creep back into the cabin. They sat close together on the hearth, not touching, but sharing its fading warmth. The space between them was a humming wire. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of wood smoke and cold winter air that clung to him. And the hunger returned. But this time, it was a different kind of hunger. It was not for food. It was a deep, aching need for something more, for the comfort of a hand on her back, for the safety of a strong arm around her, for a human touch that was not meant to cause pain. It was a hunger for something she had forgotten how to even want, a desire she had buried so deep she thought it was dead. Her hand lifted, a small, involuntary movement. She wanted to reach out, to lay her fingers on his arm, to feel the solid reality of him, to confirm that this moment, this man, this feeling of safety was real. It was a pure, desperate impulse, a longing to connect. But as her fingers trembled in the air between them, an image flashed in her mind, sharp and ugly as a shard of glass. Thomas's face, sneering and cruel, his breath sour with whiskey. She could feel the phantom weight of his hand on her, hear his voice whispering her failings in her ear. The ghosts were not gone. They were only waiting in the shadows. She snatched her hand back as if she had been burned, curling it into a tight fist in her lap. The moment was broken. The humming wire went slack. Without a word, she stood up and retreated to her cot, pulling the thin blankets up to her chin. Elias remained by the fire, his back to her, a silent, brooding shape in the darkness. Later, long after the fire had died completely and the only light was the pale moonlight on the snow outside, Clara lay awake, listening to the sound of his steady breathing. The cabin was filled with a new kind of silence, one that ached with unspoken things. She thought of his scarred hands, his quiet strength, the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her. She thought of his fingers brushing against hers, a touch so brief yet so powerful it had reawakened a part of her she thought was lost forever. In the cold, absolute dark, she whispered the words to herself, a confession to the ghosts and the night. "I can't forget your touch." And in that whisper, she finally admitted the truth of her own heart, a fragile and terrified thing, beginning to beat again. The world began to weep, for days. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the cabin roof, a constant patter on the damp earth below. The great silence of the snow was broken. Long, dirty fingers of soil and dead grass reached through the white blanket. and the air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, loamy scent of the thaw. The creek at the bottom of the rise began to speak again, its voice a low gurgle at first, then a confident rush as it threw off its shackles of ice. With the melting of the snow, Elias Ward was no longer a prisoner of the storm. The path to town, while muddy and treacherous, was passable. Yet, he did not leave. The lame horse was his excuse, a convenient reason that satisfied the need for plausible explanations. He said the gelding needed more time for a strained tendon to heal, but Clara knew, and she suspected he knew too, that the horse was only part of it. He had fallen into the rhythm of the place, or perhaps they had created a new rhythm together. He spent his days making repairs the winter had demanded, rechinking the logs where the wind had found its way in, and fashioning a new, sturdier hinge for the cellar door. He moved about her property with a quiet sense of purpose, a man settling into a space, not just passing through it. His presence had transformed the cabin from a cold shell of survival into something that felt perilously close to a home. The constant gnawing fear in Clara's gut had eased, replaced by a low, simmering warmth that was both wonderful and terrifying. She found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the easy strength in his shoulders, the way he focused on a task with an unwavering intensity. She would catch his scent on the air, wood smoke, pine, and something that was uniquely his own, and a strange fluttering would start in her chest. She was coming back to life, and it frightened her more than the starvation had. After a week, their supplies were low again. This time, there were no rabbits to be found nearby. Elias announced he would ride into Redemption for flour, salt, and coffee. Clara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The town was a beast she had learned to avoid. Elias, by associating with her, was walking straight into its open maw. "Let me write a list," she said, her voice small. "You can leave it with Mr. Abernathy at the general store. Tell him I will settle up with my sewing at the end of the week." It was a way of separating him from her, of making the transaction hers alone. Elias simply looked at her, his dark eyes missing nothing. "I have a few dollars," he said quietly. "It is no trouble." He did not mention her plan to keep him at a distance, but his gaze told her he understood it perfectly. He was gone most of the day. Clara found it impossible to settle. The cabin felt cavernous and silent again, the silence a hollow echo of the loneliness she had once mistaken for peace. She paced the floor, tidied things that were already tidy, and strained her ears for the sound of his horse. When she finally saw him riding up the path late in the afternoon, his saddlebags bulging, the relief that washed over her was so intense it left her weak. He was quiet as he unpacked the supplies on the small wooden table. He had bought more than she had asked for: a small slab of bacon, a bag of dried apples, and even a bar of lye soap. She looked at the bounty, her heart aching with a gratitude she could not voice. "Did you have any trouble?" she asked, her back to him as she put the flour away. "None to speak of," he said, his voice flat. But he was lying. She could feel it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way he avoided her eyes. Something had happened. In truth, Redemption had received him with the cold, watchful suspicion it reserved for all strangers, a suspicion that had sharpened into something uglier when they learned where he was staying. Mr. Abernathy, a portly man with a perpetually disapproving frown, had filled his order while firing questions like rifle shots. "Staying out at the old Hensley place, are you? Strange choice. It is a grim spot." "It is quiet," Elias had replied, keeping his voice even. A few other men in the store, ranchers in for supplies, had stopped their own conversations to listen. Their eyes measured him, taking in his worn clothes, the gun on his hip, the scars on his hands. He could feel their judgment settling on him like a shroud. As Abernathy weighed out the beans, he leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You ought to be careful, friend. That woman, she is bad luck, cursed. Some say Her husband died in a fire out there, a fire she walked away from without a scratch or a tear. They say his ghost still haunts that cabin, rattling the windows, looking for a peace he will never find. The storekeeper's eyes had widened with grim satisfaction. A man is not safe in a place like that, not with a woman like her. Elias had stared at the man, his expression unmoving, until Abernathy's smug look faltered and he turned away, busying himself with tying off the sack of flour. Elias had paid for his goods in silence, scooped them into his saddlebags, and walked out of the store, the weight of every eye in the place on his back. The words had followed him all the way back to the cabin. Bad luck, cursed. A man is not safe. He was not a superstitious man. He did not believe in ghosts that rattled windows, but he believed in the ghosts that people carried inside them. He had his own, after all. The storekeeper's warning had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a cold, creeping question. Was Clara cursed? Not by her husband's ghost, but by a sorrow so profound it had hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a haunted shell. He looked at her, seeing the fragile life that had returned to her eyes, the faint color in her cheeks, and he wondered if he was a comfort to her or just a temporary shield against a grief that would inevitably reclaim her the moment he was gone. Did she truly want his company? The company of Elias Ward? Or would any man's presence have been enough to keep the ghosts at bay for a little while? The next day, Clara walked to the edge of her property to meet the baker's wife and trade a mended tablecloth for 2 loaves of bread. Mrs. Gable was a kind woman in her own way, but her kindness was laced with a thick thread of gossip. "That man staying with you," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the cabin. "Mr. Abernathy says he is a rough sort. He is telling everyone in town that you have taken in a gunslinger. He is warning folks to stay clear, that the Hensley curse might have found a new target." Clara's blood ran cold. So, it had started. The town was poisoning him against her, trying to drive him away, to force her back into her isolation. A fierce, protective anger flared in her chest, followed immediately by a wave of despair. They were right. She was a curse. She was tainting him, drawing him into the shadow of her own ruined life. She could not bear the thought of the town looking at him with the same fear and pity they looked at her. She waited until that evening, until after they had shared their quiet meal. The tension in the cabin was a palpable thing. She knew he was waiting for her to speak of what she had heard, and she was gathering the courage to say what had to be said. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Elias, you have to leave." He looked up from the harness buckle he was mending, his hands going still. "What are you talking about?" "I heard what they are saying in town," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "That I am bad luck, that this place is haunted. They are marking you because of me. You helped me through the storm, and I am more grateful than I can ever say. But the storm is over. You have to go. For your own good." He set the piece of leather down slowly. "I have been on my own for a long time. Clara, I can decide what is for my own good." "No, you cannot," she cried, her control snapping. "You do not understand. This place, this town, it suffocates everything. They will not stop until they have ruined you just for being kind to me. I will not be the reason for that. I will not be another ghost for you to carry." "You think I care what they say?" he shot back, his voice rising, a raw edge of frustration in it. He stood up, and the small cabin seemed to shrink around him. "Do you think their whispers are the worst I have ever heard? I have slept in worse places than your shadow. Clara." His words struck her, but she was too lost in her own fear to let them in. "It is not just about you. It is about me. I cannot have you here. Every time I look at you, I feel things I have no right to feel. It is better to be alone. It is safer." "Safer?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You were starving to death in this safe place. You were fading away. Do not talk to me about safety." "I was surviving," she screamed, the word tearing from her throat. "It was not a life, But it was mine. You came here and you made me want things again, and I cannot have them. Do you not see? You have to go before—" She choked on a sob, the words dying in her throat. "Before what, Clara?" he pressed, taking a step toward her. "Before you remember what it feels like to be alive." That was it. The truth of it broke her. All the fear, all the grief she had kept locked away for 2 long years, all the hopeless, terrifying longing he had awakened in her, it all came rushing to the surface. A great shuddering sob escaped her, and then another. The dam inside her broke, and the flood was absolute. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking with the force of her weeping. The wall she had built stone by stone around her heart had finally, completely, crumbled to dust. In an instant, the anger was gone from his face, replaced by a look of profound sorrow. He closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a second, her fists clenched against his chest, but he held her firm, his arms a solid, unyielding circle around her. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his shirt, and wept. She cried for her lost years, for the cruelty she had endured, for the husband she had not mourned. She cried for the loneliness that had been her only companion and for the terrifying hope he had brought into her life. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, the other pressed firmly against her back, holding her together as she fell apart. "I know," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I know what it feels like. To lose everything, to feel like you are nothing but the wreckage." He held her for a long time, until the storm of her sobs subsided into quiet, hiccuping breaths. She was exhausted, emptied out. She leaned against him, her body pliant, her defenses gone. He smelled of leather and wood smoke, a scent that was solid and real. Slowly, she tilted her head back to look at him. His face was inches from hers, his expression tender, his eyes dark with a deep and aching compassion. The air between them was charged, no longer with anger, but with a raw and fragile vulnerability. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a kiss born of shared grief and a powerful, undeniable longing. It was the kiss of 2 lonely souls who had found a brief and stunning solace in each other's arms. She responded with an equal desperation, her hands clinging to his shirt, pulling him closer. It was a drowning woman's grasp, and he was her salvation. That night, in the dim flickering light of the fire, passion consumed them. It was a fierce and tender coming together, a physical union that was as much about comfort as it was about desire. For Clara, it was a reclaiming of her own body, a discovery that a man's touch could be a source of warmth and pleasure, not pain and humiliation. For Elias, it was a moment of connection so profound it seemed to quiet the ghosts that rode at his side. They made love with a quiet intensity, their bodies speaking a language of need and solace that words could never capture. Clara awoke the next morning to the gray light of dawn filtering through the window. She was tangled in the blankets with Elias, his arms slung protectively over her waist, his breath warm on the back of her neck. For a blissful, fleeting moment, she felt a sense of peace so complete it was dreamlike. Then, memory returned, and with it, a cold wave of shame. What had she done? She had lain with a man who was not her husband, in the very cabin she had shared with him. The town's whispers echoed in her head. Cursed, wicked. She felt the hot blush of guilt creep up her neck. She had betrayed. What? A memory? A vow to a man who had made her life a misery? It made no sense, but the feeling was there, sharp and real. A lifetime of ingrained duty warring with the tenderness she felt for the man sleeping beside her. She felt fragile, exposed, and deeply confused, as if sensing her turmoil. Elias stirred. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer against him. He did not speak, just held her. Then he propped himself up on an elbow and looked down at her. His eyes were clear, his expression gentle. He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin with an aching tenderness. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the shame she could not hide. "You do not owe me anything," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "You needed warmth." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "So did I." His words were a balm, a cool hand on a fevered brow. He was not judging her. He was not demanding anything from her. He was not framing their night together as a debt she had to repay. He was naming it for what it was, a shared and mutual need. He was placing them on equal ground, two human beings seeking comfort in a cold world. He was giving her grace. A single tear slid from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. In that simple, compassionate gesture, something inside her shifted, a fundamental realignment of her soul. The weight she had carried for 2 years, the heavy cloak of curses and whispers, suddenly felt lighter. For the first time since the fire, she did not feel like the cursed widow of redemption. She did not feel like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. In the warm morning light of her cabin, held in the arms of a scarred and gentle stranger, Clara Hensley felt, quite simply, human. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, brawling force of nature. It cracked the frozen ground, swelled the creek to a brown torrent, and sent the last of the snow retreating into the high, shadowed places of the foothills. The air softened, losing its biting edge, and the world, once a stark study in black and white, began to blush with the faint, hopeful green of new life. For Clara Hensley, it felt like the first true spring of her life. The change was not just in the land, it was inside the small cabin, in the very air she breathed. The silence was no longer a hollow ache but a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the sounds of two people sharing a life. Elias had stayed. He no longer spoke of his horse's lame leg, and she no longer asked when he might leave. He was simply there, a solid, steady presence that had become as essential as the fire in the hearth. One morning, he came in from the lean-to with a rusty spade slung over his shoulder. "The ground is soft enough," he announced. "Time to put in a garden." He had found a small, sun-drenched patch of earth behind the cabin, protected from the wind by a stand of aspen. For days, they worked side by side, turning the dark, rich soil. The physical labor was a balm. Clara felt the strength returning to her limbs, the sun warm on her back. She knelt in the dirt, her hands, once blistered from the axe, now stained with honest soil as she pressed tiny seeds into the earth. Beans, squash, corn, and a small, hopeful row of wildflowers she had bought on a trip to town with Elias. He had insisted she come with him. Walking into redemption at his side was one of the hardest things she had ever done. She had felt the familiar weight of the town's stairs, heard the sudden halt in conversations as they passed, but Elias had been oblivious to it, or had pretended to be. He had placed a hand on the small of her back as they entered the general store, a simple, proprietary gesture that sent a clear message. "She is with me." The whispers had continued, but for the first time, they seemed to lose some of their power. She was no longer just the cursed widow. She was part of something else. Working in the garden, away from the prying eyes of the world, they found a simple, uncomplicated peace. One afternoon, as Elias was trying to coax a stubborn rock from the ground, he grunted with effort, his face grimacing. The rock suddenly gave way, and he tumbled backward, landing in a heap in the soft dirt, his hat askew. A sound bubbled up inside Clara, something she had not felt in years. It started as a small giggle, but then it grew, and soon she was laughing. A full, helpless, wonderful laugh that echoed in the quiet air. Elias looked up at her from his sprawled position. A line of mud streaked across his cheek. A slow grin spread across his face, and he began to laugh with her. The sound of their shared laughter was a miracle, a vibrant splash of color in the gray landscape of her past. In that moment, surrounded by the promise of new life, it felt as if nothing could ever touch them again. But their fragile peace was a house built on a fault line, the prejudice of redemption. Denied a clear target, had been festering. It needed a new reason, a fresh outrage, and in the third week of spring, the stagecoach delivered it. It was a piece of paper, nailed to the board outside the sheriff's office, a bounty poster, fresh from Cheyenne. It offered a reward of $200 for a man named Silas Kane, wanted for armed robbery and the shooting of a deputy in Laramie County. The description was vague. Tall, dark hair, quiet disposition, skilled with a firearm. But what caught Mr. Abernathy's eye as he studied it was the mention of a distinct scar through the left eyebrow. The storekeeper's mind, always fertile ground for suspicion, made the leap instantly. Silas Kane, Elias Ward, the names were close enough, the description fit. The quiet stranger living with the cursed widow was not just a drifter. He was a wanted man. The news spread through Redemption like a prairie fire, a satisfying confirmation of everything they had already decided to believe. Of course, the widow Hensley would take up with a killer. Bad luck always finds its own kind. The rumors reached the outlying ranches, carried on the tongues of men riding into town for whiskey and supplies. On one of the largest spreads, the Cross Creek Ranch, a group of hands took the news as a personal affront. They were rough men, quick to judgment and quicker to violence, who saw themselves as the unofficial keepers of the county's moral compass. To them, a wanted man hiding out with a cursed widow in their territory was an insult that could not be ignored. One Saturday night, fueled by cheap whiskey and a potent sense of self-righteousness, 4 of them decided to act. Their names were Jeb, Frank, Billy, and a young, eager man named Cole, and they rode out of town with a bottle in one hand and a rope coiled on a saddle horn. Clara and Elias were sitting by the fire. The cabin door opened to the cool night air. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. Clara was reading aloud from a worn copy of a book Elias had bought for her, her voice soft in the quiet of the evening. It was a moment of perfect, domestic peace. The sound of hoofbeats, hard and fast, shattered the stillness. It was not the sound of a lone rider. This was a group, coming with purpose. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the gun on his hip. He moved to the doorway, placing himself between Clara and whatever was coming. The 4 riders pulled up in a chaotic clatter, their horses stamping nervously. Jeb, a big man with a florid face and a loud, belligerent voice, was their clear leader. "Evening. Hensley," he slurred, his eyes skipping past Elias to fix on Clara, who had risen to her feet behind him. "We heard you have got some company. We are here to meet the famous Silas Kane." "My name is Elias Ward," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. "You are on private property. I suggest you and your friends ride on." "Ward, Kane, it is all the same to us," Frank sneered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Elias's boot. "We do not like the notion of a woman harboring a wanted man. It ain't decent." "We are here to deliver a message from the good folk of this county," Jeb said, swinging down from his horse. The other 3 followed, fanning out, their postures aggressive. "We want your outlaw lover out of here by sunup. And as for you, widow, maybe it is time you moved on. Too, this land has had enough of your bad luck." He took a step closer, and Clara could smell the sour stench of whiskey on him. "Or maybe," he added, his voice dropping, "we will just burn this place down around you both. A good fire can cleanse a lot of sins." The word fire struck Clara like a physical blow. A cold terror seized her, and she could not breathe. She saw the orange flames, smelled the smoke, heard the roar that had consumed her past. Elias did not move, but his body went rigid. "That is the last warning you will get," he said, his voice a low growl. "Get on your horses and ride away." Jeb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Look at him! Boys! Protecting his prize!" He lunged for the doorway, his intention to push past Elias and get to Clara. It happened faster than Clara could follow. Elias moved with a lethal grace. He did not draw his gun. He met Jeb's charge with a closed fist that connected with the bigger man's jaw with a sickening crack. Jeb went down like a felled tree. Frank and Billy rushed forward together. Elias sidestepped Frank's clumsy punch and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. Frank gasped and staggered back. Clutching his side, Billy swung the whiskey bottle, but Elias ducked under it, seized the man's arm, and used his momentum to throw him headfirst into the side of the cabin. Billy hit the logs with a heavy thud and slid to the ground. Groaning, the young one, Cole, stood frozen for a second, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and drunken bravado. He reached for the pistol on his own hip. "Do not do it, son," Elias warned, his voice like ice. Cole's hand hesitated, but it was too late. He had made his choice. Elias closed the distance in 2 quick strides. He did not hit him. He simply took the gun from Cole's unresisting hand, and then, with a cold, brutal efficiency, he slammed the younger man against the porch post. Cole's head snapped back, and his eyes rolled up as he slumped to the ground, unconscious. The entire fight had lasted less than a minute. 3 men were on the ground, moaning or unconscious. The 4th, Jeb, was struggling to get to his knees, blood pouring from his mouth. Elias stood over them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at Jeb, his eyes glinting in the firelight. For a moment, Clara saw a darkness in him she had never seen before, a capacity for violence that was terrifying and absolute. He took a step toward Jeb, and she was certain he was going to kill him. "Elias, no!" she cried out, her voice thin and reedy. Her voice broke the spell. He stopped, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if a great weight had just settled on them. He looked from the broken men on the ground to his own bruised and bloodied knuckles, and then back to her. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He dragged the men, one by one, and threw them onto their horses. He slapped the rumps of the animals, sending them galloping blindly back toward town. Their riders slumped over the saddles. He came back to the porch and stood there for a long moment, staring out into the darkness. The quiet that followed was worse than the violence. The peace was shattered, their sanctuary violated. The town was no longer a distant threat. It had come to their door with ropes and torches. "They will send the sheriff now," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The fight had reignited all her fears. "They will say you tried to kill them. They will hang you." "Let them come," Elias said, his back still to her. "No," she pleaded, rushing to his side, grabbing his arm. "You have to leave, now. Tonight, you can ride south, be in the next territory by morning. I will tell the sheriff you were just passing through, that you are long gone." He finally turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes made her heart ache. "And what about you, Clara? What happens to you after they are done with me?" "I will be fine. I survived before you came. I can survive again." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The loneliness she had once endured would be an unbearable torment now that she had known something else. "I am not leaving you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Please, Elias," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I cannot watch them take you. I cannot go through that again. I cannot lose you." The words were out before she could stop them. A confession of love born from absolute terror. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, protective embrace. He buried his face in her hair. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a low, determined whisper against her ear. "I am not him. I am not going to leave you to the fire." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his hands gripping her shoulders. "If they want to burn me, they will have to burn us both. His words were a vow, terrible and beautiful. He was chaining himself to her fate. He stood his ground, an unmovable rock against the tide of her fear. She knew then that no amount of pleading would make him leave. That night, they lay together in her bed. But they did not sleep. They listened to the sounds of the night, waiting for the sound of approaching horses that would signal the arrival of the sheriff. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Clara. Elias held her, his body a warm, solid shield against the darkness. In the long, quiet hours before dawn, she told him of her dreams. She spoke of a place she had only imagined, a place by the ocean, where the air was soft and salty and the land was not so hard, a place where no one knew her name, where she was not the cursed widow, not Thomas Hensley's wife, but just a woman, a place where she could walk down a street without feeling the weight of whispers on her back. "Sometimes," she whispered into the darkness, her head resting on his chest, "I dream of a life so small and quiet no one would ever notice it, a life where the loudest sound is the ocean, and the biggest worry is whether the tide is coming in or going out." He listened without interrupting, his hand stroking her hair in a slow, steady rhythm. The simple, repetitive motion was an anchor in the storm of her fear. When she finished, the cabin was silent again, filled with the weight of her impossible dream. He tilted her chin up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in the faint moonlight. "Then maybe that is where we will go," he said softly. "When the snow falls again, we will ride west until we run out of land." Outside, the Wyoming night loomed vast and endless. The stars, cold and distant, looked down on the small cabin. There was no peace left in the quiet. Danger was no longer a distant threat. It was a living thing, a low hum of violence and retribution that vibrated just beneath the surface of the silent, waiting land. They came at dawn. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gold, a cruelly beautiful backdrop for the grim procession that rode up the muddy path to the cabin. It was Sheriff Brody, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with a weary face and a heavy silver star pinned to his vest. He was flanked by 6 men, a hastily formed posse whose members included 2 of the Cross Creek ranch hands from the night before, their faces swollen and bruised, their eyes burning with a hateful righteousness. Clara and Elias were on the porch, waiting. They had not slept. They had simply watched the night fade and listened as the world came awake, knowing this moment was inevitable. Elias stood slightly in front of Clara, his stance relaxed but ready, his hands empty at his sides. He would not give them the excuse of drawing first. "Elias Ward," the sheriff called out, his voice flat and tired. "I have a warrant for your arrest. Assault with intent to cause grievous harm." "They were on my land, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "They threatened this woman. They threatened to burn her home. I defended her. I defended myself. Jebediah Smith has 3 broken ribs and a jaw that will need wiring," Brody countered, his gaze hard. "Young Cole has a concussion so bad he cannot remember his own name. The law does not look kindly on that kind of self-defense." He gestured with his rifle. "Now, are you going to come peacefully, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" Behind the sheriff, the other men shifted in their saddles, their hands resting on their pistols. Their hunger for violence was a palpable thing, a low hum in the morning air. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment the world would snatch him away from her. The old fear, the instinct to hide, to be silent, to retreat into the shadows, screamed at her. But something else rose to meet it. The memory of his arms around her in the dark, the sound of his voice promising they would face the fire together. The woman who had trembled in fear before her own husband was gone, burned away in the fires of grief, and reborn in the warmth of this man's kindness. She stepped out from behind Elias, her chin held high, her hands were trembling, and her voice shook when she spoke. But she did not back down. "He is telling the truth. Sheriff Brody—" Every eye turned to her. The men looked at her with a mixture of surprise and contempt. The cursed widow was speaking. "Those men came here last night, drunk and looking for trouble," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "They called him a wanted man. They called me foul names. They threatened to burn my home to the ground with us inside it. Elias did what any decent man would do. He protected me." She took another step forward, her eyes locked on the sheriff's. "This man saved my life when I was starving. He has shown me nothing but kindness. If there is any justice to be had, you will listen to him. He is not the criminal here." A stunned silence followed her words. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting from Clara to the hard, unforgiving faces of the men beside him. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew which way the wind of public opinion was blowing. One of the Cross Creek men, a man with a raw, rope-burned neck, laughed harshly. "Do not listen to her. Sheriff, she is an outlaw's woman. She would say anything to protect him." "That is enough," Brody said, though his voice lacked conviction. He motioned to two of his men. "Take him." The men dismounted and moved toward the porch. Elias did not resist. He gave Clara one last, long look, his eyes filled with a silent, wrenching apology. As they bound his hands behind his back with a length of rope, he held her gaze, a final, desperate connection before the world tore them apart. They dragged him from the porch, and Clara felt a part of herself being ripped away with him. She started to follow, to scream, to protest, but the man with the burned neck stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His smile was cruel. "He will hang," the man said, his voice low and venomous. "And as for you, a town has to be cleansed of its sickness. This place is a blight. It is time we purified it." He turned to the other men. "She harbored a fugitive. She consorts with criminals. This house is as guilty as she is." He pulled a torch from his saddle roll, a length of wood wrapped in oil-soaked rags. Another man produced a match. "No," Clara whispered, her blood turning to ice. She looked at Sheriff Brody, her eyes pleading. "Sheriff, you cannot let them do this. This is my home." The sheriff looked away, his face a mask of grim resignation. He would not stop it. This was the town's justice, swift and merciless. He mounted his horse, turning his back on what was about to happen as he led the men escorting Elias away down the path. The man with the torch lit it. The flame blossomed, angry and orange in the bright morning sun. He tossed it onto the dry wooden porch. It caught instantly. A second torch followed, thrown through the open doorway, landing on the simple rag rug inside. The flames grew with a terrifying speed, licking up the walls of the cabin that had been her prison and then her sanctuary. Clara stood frozen, watching in horror. It was happening again. The fire, the smoke, the end of a world. The smell of burning pine filled the air, the same smell that had haunted her nightmares for 2 years. The men who had set the blaze mounted their horses, their faces alight with a grim, triumphant satisfaction. They had passed their judgment. They had erased the stain. As they rode away, leaving her alone with the inferno. The roof of the porch collapsed in a shower of sparks. The heat was immense, a physical blow that drove her backward. A scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure, animal agony. It was not a scream for the house, for the few meager possessions inside. It was a scream for him. "Elias!" His name was ripped from her soul as she watched the flames devour the life they had built, the fragile peace they had found. Her world was collapsing again. Not slowly this time, but in a roaring, final conflagration. She sank to her knees in the mud, the sound of the fire a deafening roar in her ears, her vision blurring with tears as the home he had made safe for her was consumed, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. In the Redemption jail, Elias paced the confines of his small, dusty cell. Through the single-barred window, He could see the smoke rising from the direction of the foothills, a thick black pillar against the blue sky. He knew what it was. He had known the moment the posse had ridden away, leaving Clara behind with those men. A cold, helpless rage burned in his gut, hotter than any fire. Sheriff Brody sat at his desk, staring at a piece of paper in his hand. He looked older than he had that morning, the weight of his office pressing down on him. A telegraph had come through an hour ago from the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne. "It was a mistake," Brody said, his voice flat, not looking up from the paper. "The man they wanted, Silas Kane. They caught him near Fort Laramie 2 days ago. He confessed to everything. The description was close, the scar and all. But you are not him. Your name is clear." Elias stopped pacing and gripped the bars of his cell. "So you are letting me go?" Brody finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a weary pity. "The bounty is void, but that does not change what happened with the Cross Creek boys. Jeb Smith's father owns half this county. He is screaming for a rope. The town, they have made up their minds about you. Ward, officially, you are free to go. But I am telling you as one man to another, you are not safe here. They will find a way to see you hang, law or no law." Elias knew the sheriff was right. His name might be clear, but his reputation was ruined beyond repair. He was the outlaw, the widow's lover. The truth did not matter anymore. All that mattered was Clara. He had to get back to her. He could not leave her alone to face the ashes of what the town had done to them. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to darken. Great, bruised-looking clouds rolled in from the west, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows of the jailhouse. A storm was coming. Elias watched the clouds gather, and a plan began to form in his mind. The storm broke just after nightfall, a furious deluge of wind and rain. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the small building to its foundations. The deputy on duty, a young man barely out of his teens, was spooked by the lightning. He was more concerned with the leaks in the roof than with his lone prisoner. In a moment of distraction, as he went to place a bucket under a new drip, he left the key ring hanging on a nail by the door. It was the chance Elias had been waiting for. He had spent the afternoon working on a loose bar in his cell, using a buckle from his belt to slowly, patiently worry at the rusted metal holding it in place. Now, with the deputy's back turned and the thunder masking the sound, he gave the bar one final, desperate wrench. It came free with a low groan. He squeezed through the narrow opening, silent as a shadow. A moment later, he was out the back door of the jailhouse and melting into the storm-tossed darkness of the alley. He found his horse in the livery, saddled and ready. He had paid the stable boy $1 to keep it that way. He rode out of Redemption, not on the main road, but through the backways and open fields, a ghost moving through the tempest. The ride was a desperate, punishing journey. The rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the path to a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, briefly illuminating a world of chaos. But Elias rode on, his mind fixed on a single purpose, Clara. He found what was left of the cabin just before midnight. The fire was out, drowned by the relentless rain. All that remained was a blackened, skeletal ruin, hissing and steaming in the downpour. The chimney stood like a lonely tombstone in a graveyard of charred logs and ash. The garden they had planted, their small patch of hope, was a trampled, muddy ruin. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse against the wind. "Clara!" There was no answer. A terrible fear gripped him. He swung down from his horse and began to search the wreckage, his heart pounding. He found her huddled beneath a small overhang of rock a short distance from the cabin, a place that offered meager shelter from the storm. She was wrapped in a thin, wet blanket, her body shivering uncontrollably. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair plastered to her head by the rain. Her eyes were wide and vacant, staring into the darkness, her spirit seemingly extinguished. He knelt in front of her, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek. Her skin was ice cold at his touch. Her hollow eyes slowly focused on his face, as if seeing a ghost. "Elias?" she whispered, her voice a broken, fragile thing. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against the cold and the dark. She was limp at first, unresponsive, and then a great, shuddering tremor went through her. She collapsed against him, her body finally surrendering to the shock and grief. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the wet fabric of his coat. "I thought you were gone," she sobbed, her words muffled against his chest. "I watched them take you. I saw the fire. I thought I would die here, hungry and alone, just like before." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, forcing her to look at him. His own face was a mask of grief and fury, his eyes burning with an intensity that cut through her daze. "Listen to me," he said, his voice thick and raw. "You will never be hungry again, not while I am breathing." It was a vow, an oath sworn in the ashes of their ruined home, a promise of a life he would build for her, for them. He pulled her to her feet, wrapping her in his own warm, dry coat. He led her to his horse and lifted her into the saddle, climbing up behind her, his arms a protective circle around her. The rain began to mix with the smoke still rising from the embers, the scent of their loss washing over them. Together, with Clara leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest, they turned the horse away from the ruins. They rode into the stormy night, leaving the hatred of redemption behind them. They headed west, toward the distant, unseen mountains, chasing a dream of a quiet shore that now felt more impossible and more necessary than ever before. They rode west for 2 months, into a land that grew wilder and more beautiful with every passing mile. They left Wyoming behind, crossing into territory where the mountains were sharper, the rivers colder, and the towns fewer and farther between. They were chasing Clara's dream of a quiet place, a place where their past could not find them. They found it in a small, forgotten valley in the shadow of the Sawtooth Mountains, a cup of green land held in the palm of granite peaks. A river, clear and fast, cut through the valley floor, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It felt like the first place on earth, a place untouched by judgment. Here, they stopped running. With the last of their money, they bought an old pack mule, an axe, a saw, and a few meager supplies from a trading post 50 miles south. Then, they began to build. They chose a spot on a gentle rise overlooking the river, where the morning sun would strike first. Elias felled the trees, his axe swinging in a steady, powerful rhythm that became the heartbeat of their new life. Clara helped him peel the logs and notch the ends, her hands growing strong and calloused. Together, they raised the walls of a small, sturdy cabin, a home born not of necessity and fear, but of shared will and hope. The months bled into one another, marked by the changing seasons. Life was hard, stripped down to its barest essentials, but it was a life of their own making. It was fragile, a delicate seedling in a harsh landscape, but it was, for the first time, peaceful, slowly, miraculously. Clara's laughter returned. It was a rare and precious sound, usually sparked by something small, the comical antics of a squirrel, the sight of Elias with a smudge of soot on his nose. Each time, it sounded a little less rusty, a little more like her own. Elias worked the land with a tireless devotion. He cleared a field, planted corn and potatoes, and hunted in the high country, always returning with meat for their table. He was a creator now, a homesteader. His hands, once instruments of violence and survival, were now tools of cultivation and building. He was planting roots in the earth for both of them. Clara, in turn, cultivated their home. She tended a small vegetable garden that thrived in the valley's rich soil. She sewed new curtains for the window and a warm quilt for their bed. And she began to write, in a worn leather notebook Elias had bought for her. She started to chronicle her memories. At first, she wrote of the darkness, of Thomas, of the fire, of the town's cruelty. It was a painful exorcism, putting the ghosts to rest one word at a time. But then, she began to write of the journey west, of the color of the sky over the plains, of the quiet strength in Elias's hands. She was rewriting her own story, finding her voice in the wilderness. Yet, even in their sanctuary, the scars remained. Peace was a guest, but fear was a permanent resident. Every distant sound that was not the river or the wind was a potential threat. A lone trapper passing through the valley sent Elias reaching for his rifle, his body coiled and ready, until the man was long gone. Clara would sometimes wake in the middle of the night from a dream of fire, her heart pounding, the smell of smoke phantom in her nostrils. They never spoke of it, but the fear was a silent third partner in their life, a constant reminder that they were exiles, fugitives from a world that had condemned them, the ache of what they had lost, not the burned cabin, but the possibility of a normal life. The right to live without looking over their shoulder was a quiet undercurrent to their happiness. One morning in late summer, as Clara was weeding her garden, she heard it, the sound that had haunted her waking and sleeping hours, the sound of riders, more than one, approaching from the south end of the valley. Her blood ran cold. She stood up, her hand shading her eyes, and saw 3 figures on horseback, moving steadily toward their cabin. Elias was at the river, watering the mule. He saw them at the same moment she did. He dropped the reins and ran toward the cabin, his face a grim, hard mask. The peace was over. The past had found them. "Get inside, Clara," he ordered, his voice low and urgent as he grabbed his rifle from its pegs beside the door. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It does not matter. Get inside and bar the door." But she could not move. She was paralyzed by the sight of the approaching men, the terrible, familiar echo of the posse coming to destroy her world. The riders drew closer, and Clara's heart sank. The man in the lead, the man with the silver star glinting on his vest, was Sheriff Brody. Elias stepped onto the small porch, his rifle held loosely in his hands, pointed at the ground. He would not give them a reason. He stood between his home, the home he had built with his own hands, and the law that had come to take him from it. The sheriff and his 2 deputies reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin. Brody looked older, his face more deeply lined than Clara remembered. He looked at the sturdy cabin, the neat garden, the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. He looked at Elias, standing his ground, and then his gaze fell on Clara, who remained frozen by the corner of the house. "Elias Ward," Brody said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "It has been a long ride." "Longer for us, Sheriff," Elias replied, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "You know what I want. The matter of the assault on the Cross Creek men is still outstanding. I have a warrant." It was the end. Clara felt the world tilt on its axis. After all this, after everything they had built, it was all to be torn down. She watched Elias's shoulders tense. He was preparing to fight or to die. But then, something inside him seemed to settle. He looked from the sheriff to Clara, and his expression softened. He had made a promise to her in the ashes of their old life, a promise to keep her safe. He could not do that if a gunfight erupted in their front yard. He could not risk her. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. He raised his hands to his shoulders, a clear sign of surrender. "All right, Sheriff," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "There is no need for trouble. You can take me. Just give your word that you will leave her be. She has had enough." He was giving himself up. He was going to sacrifice his own freedom, his life, to spare her. He was choosing to walk back into the darkness so that she could stay in the light. And in that moment, something inside Clara broke, not in the way she had broken before, into 1,000 pieces of fear and despair, but in a new way. It was the breaking of a dam, releasing a flood of courage she never knew she possessed. The woman who had been silenced, who had hidden, who had whispered her hopes only in the dark, was gone. She moved. She walked off the porch and stood directly between Elias and the sheriff's rifle. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong, ringing with a righteous fury that made all three men stare at her in disbelief. "No," she said, "you will not take him." "Clara, get back in the house," Elias said, his voice strained. She ignored him. She fixed her gaze on Sheriff Brody, her eyes blazing. "You will not take an innocent man. I was there. Sheriff, I saw what happened. And if you take him, I will follow you. I will follow you all the way to the territorial capital in Cheyenne if I have to. I will stand up in front of any judge, any jury, and I will testify. I will tell them how your town drove us out. I will tell them how your men burned my home to the ground while you stood by and watched. And I will tell them that the bounty on his head was a lie, a mistake you were too cowardly to admit. You came here for justice. Then let us speak of justice." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. She was not the trembling victim they remembered. She was a force, a woman demanding to be heard, armed with nothing but the truth. Sheriff Brody stared at her, his face a mixture of astonishment and something else. Shame. He looked at her, standing proud and defiant in her simple, homespun dress, her face filled with a strength he had never seen. He looked at Elias, standing behind her, his eyes filled with a stunned, fierce pride. He looked at the home they had built, a testament to their will to live. The certainty he had ridden in with began to crumble. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man defeated not by force, but by conscience. He lowered his rifle. The warrant was rescinded. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice low, his eyes unable to meet hers. "It was rescinded 5 months ago." Clara and Elias stared at him, uncomprehending. "Jebediah Smith's father," the sheriff explained, his gaze fixed on his saddle horn. "He found out his boy and the others were drunk and looking for trouble when they went to your place. He knew a trial would only bring shame on his family name. He dropped the charges the next week. As for the bounty, the wire clearing you came through the day we arrested you. You have been a free man all this time." "Free." The words seemed to fall from a great height, landing with no weight at all. They had been running from ghosts, their exile, their fear, their life on the run. It had all been for nothing. A wave of dizziness washed over Clara. Elias stepped forward and put his arm around her, holding her steady. They were free. But the years of being branded, of running, of looking over their shoulders, had taken their toll. The news was not a pure, clean joy. It was a heavy, complicated thing, tangled up with the bitterness of their needless suffering. Sheriff Brody turned his horse. "I'm sorry for your troubles," he said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. Then he and his deputies rode away, leaving Clara and Elias standing in the silent valley. Finally, irrevocably, alone and free. That night, they did not stay in the cabin. They built a fire under the vast, star-dusted sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine. They sat for hours, not speaking, simply being together in the great, quiet stillness of their freedom. The weight of the past was finally lifted, and in its place was a quiet, profound exhaustion. Later, they lay together on a bed of blankets, the fire burning down to a soft, pulsing glow. He pulled her close, and they made love with a slowness and tenderness that was a kind of prayer. It was not a desperate clinging in the dark, but a quiet, certain communion. Every touch was a reassurance, every kiss a rewriting of the past. It was a final, gentle binding of their souls, a testament to everything they had endured and everything they had become. As they lay in the aftermath, tangled together, tears began to slide silently from Clara's eyes. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a release so deep she had no other way to express it. He felt them on his cheek and kissed them away, his lips tasting the salt of their shared history. She looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the starlight, and whispered the words that had become the truth of her life, the anchor of her soul. "I can't forget your touch." The story closed with the first light of dawn spilling over the granite peaks, pouring liquid gold into their small valley. The west was still a harsh and unforgiving land, vast and indifferent, but for the man and woman lying by the dying embers of their fire, their faces turned toward the rising sun, it was, at long last, a world alive with hope. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.